Israeli bombs target Gaza's crowded Rafah as the U.S. warns Israel against sending troops there. Israel has bombed targets in Rafah after U.S. officials warned Israel against expanding its Gaza ground offensive to the southern city where more than half of the territory's 2.3 million people have sought refuge. Israel bombed targets in overcrowded Rafah early Friday, hours after Biden administration officials and aid agencies warned Israel against expanding its Gaza ground offensive to the southern city where more than half of the territory's 2.3 million people have sought refuge. Airstrikes overnight and into Friday hit 2 residential buildings in Rafah, while 2 other sites were bombed in central Gaza, including one that damaged a kindergarten-turned-shelter for displaced Palestinians. 22 people were killed, according to AP journalists who saw the bodies arriving at hospitals. U.S. President Joe Biden said Thursday that Israel's conduct in the war, ignited by a deadly October 7 Hamas attack, is over the top. The harshest U.S. criticism yet of its close ally, and an expression of concern about a soaring civilian death toll in Gaza. The health ministry in Hamas-run Gaza said Friday that the overall Palestinian death toll is now approaching 28,000, with about 2/3 women and children. The count does not distinguish between civilians and combatants. Israel's stated intentions to expand its ground offensive to Rafah also prompted an unusual public backlash in Washington. We have yet to see any evidence of serious planning for such an operation, Vedant Patel, a State Department spokesman, said Thursday. Going ahead with such an offensive now, with no planning and little thought in an area where there is sheltering of 1 million people would be a disaster. John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesperson, said an Israel ground offensive in Rafah is not something we would support. The comments signaled intensifying U.S. friction with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who pushed a message of total victory in the war this week. At a time when U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Israel to press for a ceasefire deal in exchange for the release of dozens of Hamas-held hostages. Aid agency officials also sounded warnings over the prospect of a Rafah offensive. We need Gaza's last remaining hospitals, shelters, markets, and water systems to stay functional, said Catherine Russell, head of the UN Children's Agency UNICEF. Without them, hunger and disease will skyrocket, taking more child lives. With the war now in its 5th month, Israeli ground forces are still focusing on the city of Khan Yunis, just north of Rafah, but Netanyahu has repeatedly said Rafah will be next, creating panic among hundreds of thousands of displaced people. Netanyahu's words have also alarmed Egypt, which has said that any ground operation in the Rafah area or mass displacement across the border would undermine its 40-year-old peace treaty with Israel. The mostly sealed Gaza-Egypt border is also the main entry point for humanitarian aid. Shortly after midnight Friday, a residential building was struck near Rafah's Kuwaiti hospital, killing 5 people from the Al-Sayed family, including 3 children and a woman. A second Rafah strike killed 3 more people. Another overnight strike, in the central town of Deir al-Balah, claimed 9 lives. Also in central Gaza, a strike hit near a kindergarten-turned-shelter, damaging the building. It killed 5 and wounded several more people. Witnesses said shelter residents were asleep at the time. A woman, carrying a small girl in her arms, shouted as she arrived at the local Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital, "What can we do? This is the work of the coward Zionist enemy that chooses innocent civilians. This girl is firing rockets at the Jews? May God help us." Some of the wounded children were treated while lying on the floor. More than half of Gaza's population has fled to Rafah, heeding Israeli evacuation orders ahead of the military's continuously expanding ground offensive. Evacuation orders now cover 2/3 of the besieged territory, though an estimated 300,000 Palestinians remain in the northern half of Gaza, which civilians were ordered to leave early on in the war. Even in areas of refuge, such as Rafah, Israel routinely launches airstrikes against what it says are Hamas targets. It holds the militant group responsible for civilian casualties because it operates from civilian areas. Israel's 4-month-old air and ground offensive, among the most destructive in recent history, has killed 27,947 Palestinians and wounded more than 67,000, local health officials said Friday. The war has driven most people from their homes and pushed 1/4 of the population toward starvation. Biden has said he continues to work tirelessly to press Israel and Hamas to agree on an extended pause in fighting. A truce would be linked to the release of dozens of hostages, out of some 250 seized October 7, and still believed to be in Hamas captivity. Netanyahu has rejected Hamas demands for a hostage deal, which includes an end to the war and the release of hundreds of veteran Palestinian prisoners serving long sentences in Israel for deadly attacks carried out as part of the long-running conflict. Netanyahu dismissed Hamas demands as delusional, even as Blinken said he believes continued negotiations, through mediators Egypt and Qatar, are possible. Israel's war goals appear increasingly elusive, as Hamas re-emerges in parts of northern Gaza, which was the first target of the offensive and has seen widespread destruction. Israel has only rescued one hostage, while Hamas says several have been killed in airstrikes or failed rescue missions.